A peasant woman agreed to marry a blind man for safety, not knowing he was the crown prince. The church bell tolls as she takes his hand, thinking only of bread, shelter, and survival. He speaks with gentle words, unlike any man she has known. Yet whispers drift through the village. The missing prince still lives, hidden and blind. Then come the soldiers' boots pounding, torches blazing, searching every cottage, every soul. And in the glow of firelight, her husband's secret slips. He is no beggar. He is heir to the throne, but the crown is not his yet. A ruthless cousin. Plots, blades are drawn, and loyalty is tested. Now the fate of a kingdom rests on the courage of a peasant bride who never meant to be queen. Can their love survive betrayal and war, or will her vow for safety cost them both their lives? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The bitter wind howled through the gaps in the thatched roof as Annalise knelt before the cold hearth, her fingers trembling as she struck the flint again and again. Dawn had not yet broken over their small village, but already she could hear her younger siblings, Hans and Clara, coughing in their shared bed. "Please catch," she whispered, watching the sparks scatter across the kindling. Finally, a tiny flame took hold, and she carefully fed it with precious bits of dry wood. The fire's weak light cast dancing shadows on the cottage walls, barely holding back the darkness of the winter morning. "Annalise?" Her mother's voice, thin with worry, came from the corner where she lay. "Did you check what's left of the bread?" "Yes, mother." Annalise's heart grew heavy as she thought of the meager heel of dark bread, wrapped carefully in the cleanest cloth. "There's barely enough for Hans and Clara's breakfast." Mother Greta pushed herself up on her thin arms, her face lined with exhaustion. "The creditors were at the widow Meyer's door yesterday. They took her cow." Her voice shook. "We've nothing left to give them when they come here." The sound of her siblings' coughing grew louder, and Annalise hurried to tuck the blanket more tightly around their shoulders. Clara's cheeks were flushed with fever, while Hans tried to suppress his cough, ever mindful of being the man of the house since their father's passing. "I'll find a way," Annalise promised, though her own stomach cramped with hunger. She had been giving most of her portion to the children for days now. The morning light was just beginning to creep through their small window when a knock came at the door. Annalise opened it to find Father Bernard, snow-dusting his black cassock, his kind face grave with purpose. "Good morrow, Annalise," he said softly. "Might we speak privately?" She followed him outside, pulling her thin shawl tight against the cold. Their breath formed clouds in the frozen air as Father Bernard led her a few steps from the cottage. "My child," he began, his eyes full of fatherly concern, "I know of your family's struggles. There may be a solution, though it requires great sacrifice on your part." Annalise's heart quickened. "What kind of solution, Father?" "There is a man, Matthias by name, who lives in a cottage near the forest. He is—" Father Bernard paused, choosing his words carefully. "He is blind, but of good character. He seeks a wife to keep his home and offer companionship. In return, he can provide steady food and protection for you, and by extension, your family." Annalise's hands trembled, and not just from the cold. "A blind man? Does he live alone?" "He does. He is reclusive, but I have known him for many years. He is gentle, learned, and would treat you with kindness." Father Bernard's voice grew softer. "I would not suggest this if I did not believe it could save your family." The sound of Clara's coughing drifted from the cottage. Annalise closed her eyes, thinking of the empty cupboard, her mother's worried face, her siblings' hollow cheeks. "I will do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the winter wind. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparations. Father Bernard secured a special license from the bishop, allowing the marriage to proceed quickly. On a gray Sunday morning, Annalise stood in the cold stone church, wearing her mother's faded best dress. Altered hastily by candlelight, her family huddled in the front pew as she approached the altar. There stood Matthias, tall and straight-backed, dressed in simple but fine clothing. His unseeing eyes were gentle, and when he turned his face toward the sound of her steps, she saw that his features were noble, if touched by sadness. "Dearly beloved," Father Bernard began, his voice echoing in the near empty church. Annalise's heart pounded as she spoke the ancient words, binding herself to this stranger. Matthias's voice was soft and cultured as he made his own vows, his hands warm as they held hers, when she slipped the ring onto her finger. A simple band Matthias had provided. Annalise felt the weight of her choice settle around her like a cloak. She looked at her new husband's sightless eyes and wondered what kind of life awaited her in his forest cottage. Would she find contentment in this marriage of necessity, or would she forever feel like a stranger in her own home? The church bells tolled, marking the end of the ceremony and the beginning of her new life. While outside the winter wind continued to blow, the morning light filtered through heavy curtains as Annalise opened her eyes, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. The bed beneath her was softer than any she had known, with blankets that smelled of lavender and clean wool. As her mind cleared, she remembered this was her first morning as a married woman. In Matthias's cottage, she heard movement beyond. The bedroom door careful, measured steps and the soft brush of hands against furniture. Matthias was already awake, navigating his home by touch. Annalise rose quietly, dressed in her simple wool dress, and smoothed her hair before opening the door. "Good morrow, Annalise," Matthias said gently, turning his face toward the sound of her footsteps. "I trust you slept well?" His courtesy surprised her. She had expected gruffness from a blind hermit, not such refined manners. "Yes, thank you," she replied, watching as he moved with surprising grace through the main room. "Pray, come sit by the fire." He gestured toward a comfortable chair near the hearth. The morning air still holds winter's chill. As Annalise settled into the chair, she took in her surroundings properly for the first time. The cottage was far more comfortable than she had expected. Polished wooden furniture gleamed in the firelight, and she spotted several silver cups on a shelf, items no peasant could afford. Books lined one wall, their leather bindings well-worn but clearly valuable. "Would you read to me?" Matthias asked, settling into the chair opposite hers. "Though I cannot see, I find great comfort in the scriptures." Annalise hesitated, embarrassed. "I never learned to read, sir." Instead of showing disappointment, Matthias smiled kindly. "Then perhaps I shall read to you." He rose and walked directly to the bookshelf, his fingers finding a specific volume without hesitation. Opening it, his fingers traced the raised letters as he quoted, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast." His voice was melodious, educated, nothing like the rough speech of the village. Annalise watched in wonder as he recited passage after passage from memory, his face animated with genuine feeling. Later that morning, Matthias surprised her again by taking up a lute that rested on a stand near the window. His fingers moved across the strings with practiced ease, drawing forth music so beautiful it brought tears to her eyes. The melody seemed to fill the cottage with warmth, transforming the simple space into something magical. "That was beautiful," she whispered when he finished. "Music speaks what words cannot," he replied, his fingers still resting on the strings. "It has been my constant companion these past years." As the day progressed, Annalise explored the cottage. Further, everything she discovered seemed at odds with what she had. The windows were fitted with clear glass, not the cloudy panes found in peasant homes. The kitchen held copper pots and fine earthenware, and she found stores of spices that even the village merchant didn't stock. Venturing outside in the late afternoon, she examined the cottage's exterior. The walls were solid stone, the roof newly thatched, and the garden well tended despite its winter barrenness. This was no beggar's dwelling, yet Father Bernard had spoken of Matthias as though he were a man of humble means as evening approached. Annalise prepared a simple supper of broth and bread, carrying it to the table where Matthias waited. She placed the bowl before him, carefully describing its location as Father Bernard had instructed. "My deepest gratitude, my lady," Matthias said, his choice of words startling her. No one had ever addressed her so formally. He lifted the spoon with the precise movements of one accustomed to fine dining, not the rough manner of a forest dweller. Watching him eat, Annalise's mind turned over everything she had observed throughout the day. The books, the silver, his refined speech and manner, the quality of the furnishings. The question that had been building all day rose urgently in her. Thoughts, why did this man, who spoke like a lord and lived surrounded by signs of wealth, present himself as a blind beggar in need of a peasant wife? The firelight cast shadows across Matthias's noble features as he thanked her again for the meal, his courtly phrasing only deepening the mystery of his true identity. The winter sun had barely warmed the frosty morning when Annalise set out toward her mother's cottage, carrying a heavy basket laden with food. Her heart felt lighter knowing she could now help her family. In just 2 days, she had discovered that Matthias's pantry held more than enough to share fresh bread, dried meat, and even precious honey. The path through the woods was familiar, every tree and stone a childhood friend. As she walked, Annalise thought of how different her new life was from what she had expected. Matthias had shown nothing but kindness, treating her more like a cherished companion than a servant wife. After visiting with her mother and siblings, leaving them wide-eyed at the bounty she brought to Annalise, headed back toward home. But as she approached the village square, she found it transformed. A dozen soldiers in royal livery sat astride magnificent horses, their polished armor gleaming in the winter light. A crowd had gathered, and the air hummed with excitement. Hear thee! A herald's voice rang out across the square. By order of His Majesty the King, we seek information regarding Crown Prince Matthias, who did not perish in the great fire of 1694, as was believed. Annalise's heart skipped a beat. She pressed closer, straining to hear every word. The prince was grievously injured, his sight taken from him. The herald continued. There is reason to believe he lives still, hidden among common folk. Any person with knowledge of his whereabouts shall be richly rewarded. The crowd erupted in whispers. Annalise watched as her neighbors huddled together, trading theories and gossip. I heard tell the prince was most learned. Old Martha the baker whispered loudly. Spoke 5 languages, they say. My cousin's wife's sister served at court, added Thomas the cooper. Says he was tall and fair, with the finest manners in all the kingdom. Each word seemed to strike Annalise like a physical blow. Tall and fair, learned, blind. The similarities were too striking to ignore. With trembling legs, she hurried back toward the cottage, her mind whirling. The fine furnishings, the books, Matthias's courtly manner, everything began to fit together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. As she approached home, her blood ran cold. 2 soldiers were dismounting before the cottage. Matthias stood in the doorway, calm and composed as always. Good day, gentlemen, he said, his voice steady. How may I be of assistance? Searching for a missing person of great importance, one soldier replied gruffly. Need to check every dwelling in the area. Matthias nodded gracefully. Bien sûr, messieurs. Je vous en prie. He caught himself almost instantly, switching back to English. That is to say, you are most welcome to look wherever you wish. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. Perfect French, spoken with the accent of nobility, not a merchant or tutor. The soldiers, focused on searching the cottage's exterior, seemed not to notice the slip, but Annalise noticed. She noticed everything now, the way Matthias stood with perfect posture, how his hand rested on the doorframe with unconscious elegance, the subtle authority in his voice that made even armed soldiers treat him with instinctive respect. After the soldiers departed, finding nothing to arouse their suspicions, Annalise followed Matthias back inside. The evening settled around them as she prepared their supper, her movements mechanical as her mind raced with questions. They sat before the fire afterward, as had become their custom. The flames cast flickering light across Matthias's noble features that might indeed belong to a prince. He sat with that same perfect posture, his unseeing eyes directed toward the fire's warmth. Annalise studied him intently. The fine bones of his face, the elegant hands that could play the lute so beautifully. The educated way he spoke, everything about him whispered of nobility carefully disguised. In that moment, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls of their small cottage, the truth became startlingly clear. She was not merely married to a blind man who lived in the forest. She was married to Crown Prince Matthias himself. The fire crackled softly on the hearth as Annalise cleared away their supper dishes, her mind still churning with questions from the day's revelations. Matthias sat in his usual chair, fingers moving with practiced grace over the strings of his lute. The familiar domestic scene felt different now. Charged with unspoken tension, she watched as he adjusted the pegs, turning them with delicate precision until each string sang true. His movements were too refined, too educated like everything else about him. The weight of her suspicions pressed against her chest until she could bear it no longer. "Matthias," she said softly, setting down the last dish. "May I ask you something?" His fingers stilled on the lute strings. "Of course, my dear." Annalise gathered her courage, remembering the soldiers in the square. "Why do you speak like nobility?" The question hung in the air between them. Matthias's face remained composed, but his hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the lute. "I had some education," he said carefully, "before my accident." "It is more than that," Annalise pressed gently, moving closer to his chair. "Your manner, your learning, the French you spoke today, these are not the marks of simple education." A long silence followed, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning wood. When Matthias spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated." He set the lute aside with careful movements. "Tell me, what do you think you know?" "I think," Annalise's heart pounded, but she forced herself to continue. "I think you are Prince Matthias." The truth of it showed in how still he became, like a deer sensing danger. For several heartbeats, he said nothing at all. "You need not fear," she added quickly. "I would never—" "Yes." His single word cut through her reassurance. "You are right." Annalise sank into the chair opposite him, her legs suddenly weak. Though she had suspected it, hearing him confirm it made her dizzy. "I am Prince Matthias," he continued, his voice gaining strength. Or rather, I was. "Now I am simply Matthias, the blind man in the forest cottage. What happened?" she asked softly. He turned his face toward the fire, its light playing across features that now seemed unmistakably royal. 4 years ago, there was an attempt on my life. Poison in my wine cup, but it was not intended to kill, only to blind. My enemies thought a blind prince would be easily controlled or would step aside entirely. A bitter smile touched his lips. They were right about the latter. Annalise listened, transfixed as he continued. My most trusted servants smuggled me away before my enemies could confirm their success. They arranged this refuge, this simple life where no one would think to look for a prince. He gestured around the cottage. Only Father Bernard knows. He has been my link to the outside world, bringing books, news, and arranging a marriage when it became clear I needed help to maintain this facade. So our marriage was not just for companionship, Annalise said, understanding dawning. No, Matthias admitted, though I never meant to deceive you entirely. I simply still believed, that I am unfit to rule, a blind king. It would be seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation to our enemies, and after hiding away like a coward. He shook his head. The scandal alone would destabilize the kingdom. Annalise watched him, this proud man brought low by circumstance, and felt her heart ache. The weight of his secret, the burden of his choice, seemed to press him deeper into his chair. I understand if this changes things, he said quietly. If you wish to know, Annalise interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. I made a vow before God, and I will keep it. Your secret is safe with me, Matthias. She reached out and took his hand, feeling it tremble slightly in her grip. The simple gold ring on her finger caught the firelight, and she stared at it in wonder. She had entered this marriage to save her family from hunger, thinking herself bound to a simple blind man. Now she knew she was wife to a prince of the realm. Fear fluttered in her chest, fear of discovery, of the dangers that must surely come with such a secret. But there was something else too, a strange awe at how fate had led her here, and a growing determination to protect this gentle, wounded man who had treated her with such kindness. "Thank you," Matthias whispered, his fingers tightening around hers. They sat together in silence as the fire burned low, each lost in thoughts of what this truth might mean for their future. The winter wind howled through bare branches as Annalise and Matthias made their way to the woodpile behind the cottage. Her gloved hand rested on his arm, guiding him through the packed snow. Though he knew the path well, she had learned he welcomed her touch, not just for direction, but for the simple comfort of connection. "The pile should be just ahead," she said, watching their feet leave parallel tracks in the fresh snow. "Father Bernard said this cold spell might last another fortnight." Matthias nodded, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Then we best lay an extra wood. Would you hand me the axe?" She placed the wooden handle in his waiting palm, watching as his fingers curled around it with practiced ease. Over these past weeks, she had discovered he was far from helpless. He simply needed someone to work alongside him, to be his eyes when tasks required them. "The log is positioned just so," she told him, guiding his free hand to touch the round of wood. He squared his shoulders and swung with confidence, the axe hitting true. The sound of splitting wood echoed through the winter-still forest. Later, arms full of cut logs, they returned to the warmth of the cottage. As Annalise stacked the wood by the hearth, Matthias moved to his shelf of books, fingers trailing along their spines until he found the one he sought. "Shall we continue your lessons?" he asked, a smile warming his voice. "You're progressing remarkably well." Annalise brushed wood chips from her skirt and joined him at the table. These daily lessons had become precious to her, not just for the knowledge gained, but for the quiet intimacy of learning together. Matthias would trace the letters with her, his hand covering hers, teaching her to form each shape with care. "Here," he said, opening the book to a marked page. "Try reading this passage." She bent over the text, sounding out the words carefully. When she stumbled, his encouragement was gentle, patient. No other man of his station would take such care with a peasant woman's education, she thought. But Matthias saw past such barriers just as she had learned to see past his blindness. As evening drew in, they shared their customary prayers by candlelight. Annalise's voice joined his in familiar verses, their words mingling in the quiet room. Afterward, Matthias took up his lute and she closed her eyes to better hear the melody, a sweet yearning tune that seemed to speak of things too tender for words. "You have such courage, Annalise," he said softly, when the last note faded. "Do you know that?" She looked up, surprised. "Courage? I don't understand." "The way you face each day, each challenge, without complaint. The way you treat me not as some broken thing to be pitied, not as a fallen prince to be feared, but simply as a man." His fingers moved restlessly over the lute strings. "You see me as I am." "Because that is who you are," she replied simply. "A man of honor, of learning, of gentle heart. Your sight was taken, but not your worth." The candlelight flickered across his face, revealing a vulnerability that made her heart ache. Here was the truth she had slowly discovered. Beneath the weight of his secret, beyond the barriers of class that should have separated them, was a soul that called to hers. They sat in companionable silence as the evening deepened. The fire popped and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside their small cottage, warmth and peace reigned. Then Matthias reached out, his hand trembling slightly in the space between them. Annalise looked at outstretched hand, the hand that had guided her through letters, that made such beautiful music, that had shown her kindness when she expected only cold duty. Without hesitation, she placed her own hand in his fingers, closed gently around hers, and in that touch was everything they had not yet said aloud. Love had grown between them, as quiet and steady as the winter snow outside, covering the bare-granged marriage with something new and beautiful. They sat together, hands clasped, while the candle burned low and the snow continued to fall. What had begun as necessity had transformed into something precious, a love born of shared trust. mutual respect, and hearts that recognized each other despite all odds. The late February thaw brought with it an unexpected visitor. Annalise was hanging linens to dry in the weak afternoon sun when she spotted a cloaked figure making his way through the melting snow toward their cottage. She hurried inside to alert Matthias. "Someone approaches," she said quietly, touching his arm. "A man in fine clothing, though travel-worn?" Matthias stiffened, his hands pausing on the book he had been reading. "Describe him to me." Before Annalise could answer, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cottage. She opened the door to find an elderly gentleman with silver hair and intelligent eyes regarding her intently. "I seek an audience with your husband," he said formally, his accent marking. "Him as educated." Matthias rose from his chair, turning toward the door. "That voice, Master Ulrich?" The elderly man pushed past Annalise and fell to one knee on the cottage floor. "Your Highness?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "At last I have found you." Annalise quietly closed the door, watching as Matthias's face filled with complex emotions, joy at hearing his old teacher's voice, worry at being discovered, fear of what this visit might mean. "Rise, old friend," Matthias said softly. "There is no need for such formality here." Master Ulrich stood, but his bearing remained deferential. "My prince, I come with grave news from the capital. Your father, the king, he has taken ill. The physicians fear." He paused, swallowing hard. "They fear he may not see another spring." Matthias gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white. "And what of the succession? Your cousin, Lord Edmund, moves to position himself as heir. He spreads whispers that you perished in the fire, or that your blindness makes you unfit to rule." Master Ulrich's voice hardened. "He would destroy everything your father built, my prince. Already his supporters gather, speaking of changes that would harm the common people." Annalise watched her husband's face as he absorbed these words. She saw the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, saw him struggling with the fears that had driven him into hiding. "I am blind, Master Ulrich," Matthias said quietly. "How can I lead a kingdom when I cannot see its people's faces?" "A king sees with more than his eyes, your highness," Master Ulrich replied. "You have wisdom, compassion, and knowledge of law. These are what truly matter." Annalise stepped forward, her heart full. "He speaks truth, Matthias. These months, I have watched you manage our household with care and intelligence. You listen deeply, judge fairly, and show kindness to all. Are these not the qualities of a true king?" She moved to stand beside him, taking his hand. "You taught me my letters, showing endless patience. You split wood and draw water, proving blindness need not mean helplessness. You play music that touches the soul, demonstrating that beauty can flourish even in darkness." Matthias turned toward her voice, his expression vulnerable. "You truly believe I could rule?" "I believe you must," she said firmly. "Not just for the kingdom's sake, but for your own. You have hidden your light too long, my love." Master Ulrich watched their exchange with growing hope. The people would rally to you, your highness. Many remember your kindness from before. And now, he gestured to Annalise. Now you have found someone who sees your true worth, who could help you bridge the gap between crown and common folk. For the first time since Master Ulrich's arrival, a small smile touched Matthias's lips. Perhaps you are both right. Perhaps it is time to stop hiding from my duty." As evening settled over the cottage, Master Ulrich took his leave, promising to return in 3 days with plans for their journey to the capital. Annalise and Matthias sat together by the hearth, the familiar crackling of the fire providing comfort as they contemplated the changes ahead. "Are you afraid?" Annalise asked softly, nestled in his embrace. "Less than I would be without you beside me," he answered, his arms tightening around her. "You give me courage, beloved." They held each other close, sharing warmth and strength, as the fire burned low. Tomorrow would bring preparations and plans, but tonight was for dreaming of a future where love and duty might walk hand in hand, where a blind prince and his common-born wife could lead their people toward better days. The Morning sun cast long shadows through the trees as Anneliese needed go in Matthias's cottage. Her siblings, Hans and Clara, played quietly by the hearth, having come to stay after Master Ulrich's warning about growing dangers in the village. The peaceful scene shattered when thundering hooves echoed through the forest. "Someone come, many." "Riders," Matthias said, turning his head toward the sound. His years of blindness had sharpened his other senses. Anneliese rushed to the window. Through the morning mist, she saw mounted soldiers emerging from the trees, their weapons glinting. These were not the king's men, their uniforms were wrong, and their faces held malice. "Lord Edmund's soldiers," Matthias said grimly. "We must flee." Now, Anneliese grabbed Clara while Matthias found his way to Hans with practiced steps. But before they could reach the back door, a torch sailed through the window. Flames caught the dry thatch of the roof, and smoke began to fill the cottage. "This way," Anneliese cried, guiding Matthias with one hand while clutching Clara with the other. Hans clung to Matthias's coat as they stumbled toward the door. The smoke grew thicker, stinging their eyes and throats. They burst out into the cold morning air, but their relief was short-lived. Soldiers had circled the cottage, their horses stamping nervously in the growing heat of the fire. "Run," Matthias commanded, pushing Hans toward Anneliese. "Take the children into the woods. I will draw them away." "No." Anneliese reached for him. But more soldiers were closing in. "You must protect them," Matthias insisted. "Go. I order you as your prince." Tears streaming down her face, Anneliese grabbed both children's hands and plunged into the underbrush. Behind them, she heard Matthias calling out in his most commanding voice, drawing attention away from their escape. They crashed through brambles, thorns tearing at their clothes. Clara whimpered, but Hans helped pull her along. The sounds of struggle grew louder behind them. Unable to resist, Anneliese turned to look. Through gaps in the trees, she saw soldiers surrounding Matthias. Despite his blindness, he stood tall, every inch a prince. But he was helpless to fight back as they seized him roughly. "Your Highness," one soldier sneered, twisting Matthias's. Arms behind his back, "Lord Edmund sends his regards." Anneliese had to clamp her hand over her mouth to stifle her cry as they dragged Matthias toward their horses. She watched, trembling, as they bound his hands and forced him onto a mount. "Search the woods," the leader commanded. "Find the woman and children." That spurred Anneliese back into motion. She urged Hans and Clara deeper into the forest, away from the sounds of pursuit. They scrambled over fallen logs and through shallow streams, trying to confuse their trail. Only when the sounds of horses and men had faded completely did Anneliese allow them to stop. They huddled beneath a great oak tree, all three shivering despite their exertion. Clara buried her face in Anneliese's skirts, while Hans kept watch with wide, frightened eyes. "Sister," he whispered, "what will happen to the blind man, to Prince?" "Matthias?" Anneliese pulled both children close, her heart aching. In the distance, smoke still rose from their burning cottage. Everything they had built together, their brief happiness, was now ashdot, but as she held her siblings, something hardened inside Anneliese. She thought of Matthias's courage, how he had sacrificed himself to save them. She remembered his gentle teachings, his music, his love that had transformed her life. "Listen to me," she said, wiping tears from Clara's cheeks. "Those men will take Matthias to the castle, to his cruel cousin, but we will not abandon him." "But how can we help?" Hans asked. "We are just common folk." "We are family," Anneliese corrected firmly. "Matthias is my husband, and I will not leave him to face this alone. Somehow, we will find a way into the castle." She looked up through the branches at the darkening sky, her voice thick with tears but determined. "I swear by all that is holy, I will not abandon him. Whatever the risk, whatever the cost, I will find him." Clara clutched her hand. "We will help you, sister." "Yes," Hans agreed, straightening his shoulders. "We will save our prince." Anneliese gathered them close again, their shared warmth a comfort in the chill forest. She had no plan yet, No idea how 3 peasants could possibly breach a castle's defenses. But she had love, courage, and determination. For now, that would have to be enough. Annalise huddled beneath a rough wool blanket in the back of a farmer's cart, trying to stay warm as it rattled along the muddy road to the royal city. Hans and Clara had been left safely with their mother, though it had broken Annalise's heart to leave them. 2 days of travel had left her bones aching and her spirits low, but determination drove her onward. The peasant woman who had offered her a ride spoke little, focused on guiding her old horse through the rutted roads. Other travelers passed them, merchants in fine carriages, soldiers on horseback, pilgrims on foot, all streaming toward the great city that grew larger on the horizon with each passing hour. When they finally reached the city gates, Annalise gasped. She had never seen walls so high or such crowds of people. The cobblestone streets bustled with activity, vendors crying their wares, children running errands, nobles in fine carriages threading their way through the press. And above it all rose the royal castle, its towers reaching toward the clouded sky. "God be with you, lass," the farmer's wife said, as Annalise climbed down from the cart. "Whatever brings you here, I hope you find it." Annalise clutched her small bundle of belongings and made her way through the crowded streets. Her heart pounded as she approached the castle's servant entrance, where workers carried in supplies and maids hurried about their tasks. She had rehearsed her story carefully during the long journey. "Please," she said to the stern-faced woman who seemed to be in charge of the kitchen staff, "I seek work. I am strong and willing to learn." The woman who introduced herself as Mistress Agnes looked her up and down with sharp eyes. "Another country girl come to seek her fortune, eh? Well, we lost 2 scullery maids to fever last month. Can you scrub floors until your hands bleed and keep a civil tongue in your head?" "Yes, mistress," Annalise replied, lowering her eyes respectfully. "I worked in service before in a country house." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had served Matthias, after all. "Very well. You'll sleep in the servants' hall with the others. One mistake and you're out on the street." Mistress Agnes gestured to an older maid. "Show her where to store her things and put her to work." The castle kitchens were vast and busy, filled with steam and the clatter of pots. Annalise was given a rough apron and set to scrubbing floors immediately. Her arms ached, but she welcomed the work. It gave her a chance to listen to the gossip flowing around her dot by midday. She had learned what she dreaded to hear. Matthias was indeed imprisoned in the castle tower. Lord Edmund, his cousin, had declared him an impostor, a blind beggar who dared claim royal blood. In 3 days' time, Matthias would be displayed before the full court, to be mocked and discredited before all the nobility. "Poor wretch," one cook's helper whispered as she passed. "They say he's truly mad, claiming to be the lost prince." "Hush," another servant warned. "Lord Edmund's spies are everywhere. Best keep your thoughts to yourself." Annalise scrubbed harder, channeling her anger into the work. How dare they mock him? How dare they doubt his nobility, when she had witnessed it firsthand in their humble cottage? As evening fell, she was assigned to clean the gallery where nobles gathered before dinner. Working by candlelight, she kept her head down as rich-dressed lords and ladies passed by, their silk slippers and leather boots tracking mud across her clean floors. "Have you heard?" one nobleman said to his companion, pausing near where Annalise worked. "Lord Edmund means to make quite a spectacle of this blind pretender." "Indeed," his friend replied with a laugh. "What sort of prince cannot even see his own realm? The very notion is absurd. Better to have him publicly shame himself than waste time with a trial." "I hear he's quite pitiful," a lady added, her voice dripping with cruel amusement, stumbling about like a drunk, quoting scripture like a mad monk. "Lord Edmund does right to end this foolishness quickly." Annalise's hands tightened on her scrub, brush until her knuckles went white. Every mocking word felt like a knife in her heart. This was her Matthias they laughed at, her gentle husband who had taught her letters by the hearth fire, who played such beautiful music, who had sacrificed himself to save her and her siblings, Rage and love surged through her veins like fire. She could not bear to think of him alone in some tower cell, hearing these same cruel whispers. Somehow, she must reach him. Somehow, she must help him prove his true identity to these sneering nobles. Her mind raced as she continued her work. Planning and plotting. She was only a scullery maid now, but she carried a truth these fine lords and ladies could never guess. She was also a prince's wife, and she would not rest until justice was done. Thunder crashed outside the great hall's windows as nobles gathered, their whispers echoing off stone walls. Rain lashed against the glass, while Lord Edmund, dressed in rich velvet, stood before the assembled court with a triumphant smile. Guards dragged Matthias forward in iron chains. His clothes were dirty, but he held his head high despite his inability to see. The crowd of richly dressed courtiers tittered and pointed. "Behold this pathetic creature," Lord Edmund proclaimed, gesturing dramatically. "He claims royal blood, yet cannot even walk without stumbling. How could such a man rule?" Cruel laughter rippled through the hall. But Matthias lifted his face, speaking in a clear, strong voice that commanded attention. "You mock what you do not understand," he said. "In my years among common folk, I learned more of true nobility than all my time at court. I saw dignity in peasant homes, faith that sustains through hardship, and justice in simple hearts. These are the qualities a king must know." His words brought uncertain murmurs. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably, touched by the truth in his speech. Lord Edmund's face darkened with rage. "Enough! I am the rightful heir." "No," a woman's voice rang out. The crowd parted as Annalise, still in her servant's dress, ran forward to stand before Matthias. "He speaks truth. I am his lawful wife, and I have witnessed his noble spirit." Gasps and exclamations filled the hall. Lord Edmund sneered. "A serving wench. You prove your low nature with every word." But Master Ulrich stepped forward, producing sealed documents. "Here's proof of his royal birth and of their legal marriage. The prince lives." With a roar of fury, Lord Edmund drew his sword and lunged toward Matthias. Guards instantly seized him, wrestling him to the ground. Matthias stood tall beside Annalise, their hands clasped together as one by one. The nobles began to bow. The great cathedral bells rang joyfully across the royal city, their deep tones echoing through streets packed with cheering people. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floors where nobles and commoners alike gathered to witness history. "Prince." Matthias knelt before the archbishop, his head bowed in humility. The golden crown settled upon his dark hair as sacred words filled the vast space. When he rose, now King Matthias, his unseeing eyes held tears of gratitude. Beside him, Annalise wore a gown of cream silk, far simpler than most royal garments, but elegant in its clean lines. The archbishop placed a smaller crown upon her head, and she became queen with quiet dignity. In the front rows, Hans and Clara watched with wide eyes, clutching their mother's hands. They sat where no peasant family had ever been permitted before, their presence marking the beginning of great change. "Today marks not just my return," Matthias proclaimed, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral, "but a new understanding of nobility. True worth lies not in titles or land, but in the heart's courage and faith." He reached for Annalise's hand, finding it without hesitation. "My queen has taught me this truth." He announced reforms that made the nobles whisper in the common. Folk weep with joy. Peasant children would be taught to read. Local courts would hear grievances from all classes equally. And royal granaries would open in times of need. Through it all, Annalise stood tall beside him. Her presence a bridge between two worlds. As evening fell, the new king and queen retired to their private chamber. A single beeswax candle cast soft light across the rich tapestries and carved furniture. Without ceremony, they knelt together beside their bed, hands clasped in familiar comfort. "Thank you, Lord," Matthias whispered, "for bringing light from darkness, hope from despair, and love from necessity," Annalise added softly, squeezing his hand. They remained there in peaceful silence, remembering the cottage where their journey began. Their future stretched before them, bright with promise, not because of the crown's power, but because of the simple strength they had found in each other's faith and love dot in a gentle candlelight. They were not king and queen, but simply Matthias and Annalise, bound together by God's grace and the quiet miracle of true affection. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here where love speaks, softly and stays.